What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 146 of the DFS Dose podcast, your fix of daily fantasy sports information, strategy, and analysis. I'm your host, Ben Hauver, joined, as I always am, by Joey Carrion. And on today's show, we continue our journey through my 2021 best ball tournament tiers, and we have an honored guest. I'm honored to be joined by one of the sharpest young minds in best ball. You've seen his work with NBC Sports Edge. You've seen his work with Establish the Run. This is a man who knows everything about best ball win rates, and that's because his rate at winning at life is through the roof. Jack Miller, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. I don't know how I can possibly follow up on that introduction, but thank you guys for having me on. Looking forward to talking running backs today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to have you on to talk about everybody's favorite position in fantasy football. This episode is part 2 in our 4-part series. Each additional episode is going to be dedicated to a specific position. You can check out the first episode live now on this YouTube channel where we break down quarterbacks with Hillo FF of 1 week season. This episode is also available as an audio journey on whatever podcast platform you use. If you're new to the podcast, like what you hear, like what you see, you can support by subscribing to this YouTube channel or subscribing on whatever podcast platform you use. It's a free, simple, and easy way to support us. Gentlemen, before we get into the tiers themselves, I just want to give a quick preface on what the tiers are themselves. They're more so a suggestion of how to prioritize more so than direct projections or direct median outcomes of what we expect these players to have. Because in best ball, we're really looking at things through the lens of a range of outcomes more so than the range of an exact projection. And we can start right off at the top. Tier 1, which consists of only one player, Christian McCaffrey. And Jack, my question to you is, do you believe that CMC belongs in this tier by himself, the way that he's regarded as the clear-cut consensus RB1 in basically every draft?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, this isn't really an actionable take because everyone's taking him 101 anyway, but I think people might still underestimate just how good McCaffrey is. He had 26.3 points per game in half PPR in 2019, 27.2 in 3 games last year. The next closest guy last season was Dalvin at 23.0. So McCaffrey is providing you a 3 or 4 point advantage every week. I think he deserves to be on top of the mountain all by himself.
Yeah. I agree with that take. And it also comes down to the opportunity to get him because, you're only got, a 1 in 12 chance to land that 101. So you kind of have to capitalize on it just in terms of exposure if you're drafting a mass amount of best ball teams.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
After Christian McCaffrey, I believe that this tier is where things start to get interesting. We've got 10 players in this secondary tier, guys that we believe have realistic paths to finishing inside the top 3 at the running back position. And, that includes Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Ezekiel Elliott, Cam Akers, Nick Chubb, Jonathan Taylor, and Aaron Jones. Do you guys believe that this is correct in terms of guys that have realistic paths to finishing inside the top 3 and producing real difference-making seasons at the position?
Yeah, I think all these guys do have a realistic path to a top 3 finish. I think I would also add Joe Mixon, Najee Harris, and Austin Eckler to this group too. I think all 3 of them have 3-down potential. The one question with Eckler is he going to get goal line carries? Mixon how much is he going to catch the ball? Geo's gone now, so I think there's a lot more room for him to improve in that area with Samaje Perine as his backup rather than Bernard. And then Harris is obviously unproven. And then the Steelers' offensive line and Najee's efficiency is going to be a concern. But I think all of them have the workload to justify being in this tier as well. And I think with this tier, I might split it up a little more because, this is kind of how ADP has it too, is after those first 5 guys, including McCaffrey. So after McCaffrey, Henry, Saquon, Dalvin, and Kamara, that's when you kind of get into the range where you could pick Kelsey or Tyreek or maybe pivot from running back. So I think it's fair to say that all of these guys have top 3 upside, but I might split it up even further. But if the only criteria is top 3 upside, I think this is a very fair group.
Are you concerned about guys like, we've seen Derrick Henry do it. Obviously, that took some touchdown variance, but are you concerned about players like him, players like Nick Chubb, and players like Aaron Jones, Jonathan Taylor, who are in guaranteed workload splits, or are the situations surrounding them good enough for you to justify taking them at the ADP range they're going, usually, back into the first, mid-first?
Yeah, so Henry, basically, for the reasons you said, I haven't been on him as much in the past just because the efficiency seems so unsustainable. He doesn't catch passes, stuff like that. But he has proven, I think, to be an outlier in that regard. And so I'm fine with Henry at his ADP. Chubb is someone I'm not on as much, although I'll still take him at ADP because in the first couple of rounds, I try not to have like too hard of stances, because if you're wrong, I mean, we're going to be wrong a lot, and if you're wrong in the first 2 rounds, it's going to just totally burn you. So I'm not going to have too much Chubb, but I'm not going to completely fade him. Jones, I think it just comes down to Rodgers, and so he's a risk right now. If Rodgers is on the field, I think Jones could catch a ton of passes because Dillon is not the same level of pass catcher as Jamal Williams. So I think Jones might cede some carries to Dillon that he would not have to Williams, but he'll make up for it with his pass catching. But it just comes down to Rodgers, and we don't really know how that situation is going to turn out right now.
Right. The uncertainty around that is really why Jones is sort of capping the end of this tier as opposed to being higher up on the list. And, we'll get to the wide receiver episode shortly. And in that scenario, I've got Devante Adams at the bottom of his tier as well, just because I think the risk is sort of outweighing the upside when the upside is comparable to some of the other players. Joey, what are your thoughts on this second tier of running backs?
I mean, I agree with the running backs that you have in this tier. I do think they have top 3 upside. I just kind of disagree with where you have them specifically ranked, but I know when you're doing tiers, that doesn't matter as much. But I really do like all of these players. I think they have upside for 2021, and I would consider these guys pretty much the workhorses that are left in the NFL, besides maybe like Aaron Jones. I think these are the workhorse running backs that you want to target in the first round of your fantasy drafts. So
I know in the past you've had issues with how bullish I am on Cam Akers. Are you still on that page as well?
So just a sneak peek or taking a look back, Ben had Cam Akers as his RB4 and in the RB1 overall upside category of his tiers until he recently changed that. And I had a problem with that because I don't think Cam Akers has overall running back 1 potential, because I personally believe Darrell Henderson will have a pretty sizable role in the offense. I know some people don't think that. That's just something that I personally believe. But as your RB7, that's pretty consensus with ADP right now. He's going as the RB8 on Underdog, I think. So pretty consensus, and I don't really mind you having him as your RB7.
Do you not think that Akers has RB1 overall upside?
I don't.
I mean, out of the last 4 seasons, the Rams offense has produced 2 RB1 overalls in terms of fantasy points per game. And this is arguably the best offense that McVay's ever coached. Akers, I don't see why he couldn't. Matthew Stafford has been somebody who dumping off to running backs and giving them sizable workloads in the passing game has been part of his game, dating back to 2015. Theo Riddick had no less than 53 catches and a high of 80 between 2015 and 2018. Even Kerryon Johnson in his rookie year, post Theo Riddick, had 39 targets in only 7 games. Swift last year was averaging over 4 per game. I think that Cam Akers has that capability. He had 30 receptions in only 11 games in his final season at Florida State. So to me, I think the upside of Cam Akers to catch 40, 50, 60 balls is there. And we know that the way the Rams operate when they get especially down into scoring position is heavily utilizing rush attempts at the goal line. Jack, what are your thoughts on Cam Akers this season? He's a polarizing option in the fantasy community right now.
I've come around on Akers throughout the offseason. I was kind of worried about I still think Henderson's going to have some role early on, but McVay and the Rams coaches have been talking up Akers' involvement in the pass game, which I think was the big thing for me because he had, I think, 14 targets last year. So they treated him as a workhorse down the stretch. The only question was just how much is he going to be used in the pass game? And given how much they've been hyping him up over the last few weeks, as well as the fact that he showed that ability in college, and Henderson doesn't exactly profile as, a third down back. He kind of profiles as more of just someone who can do it all and someone who could just end up being the backup to Akers. So I think Akers probably should see a spike in pass game involvement this year, and so I'm fine with Akers at ADP. I think he's going like late first right now in Underdog. I'm not specifically like reaching for him there, but I think he's a fine pick.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So some of the other guys that are going in that range, we'll move to tier 3 here. And, this is a tier of guys that I believe, still have realistic top 12 upside. Jack made, the case that several of these 4 players deserve to be in the tier above, and Joe Mixon, Najee Harris, Austin Eckler. The guy that you left out of that suggestion was Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and he's a polarizing player. He went from being early 3rd round pick last year to going inside the top 6, burned a lot of people in that spot. But, the reason that people were still on him remains. He does have a lot of workload opportunity in arguably the best offense in the NFL.
Right. I think my one concern with Clyde is that his workload diminished throughout the year, and they still have Jamal Williams, and then they brought in McKinnon. So there are some signs that maybe he might not be the 3-down back that we want him to be in Kansas City, but he's also going later than Mixon, Eckler, and Najee. So you can get Clyde, 6 to 8 picks after some of these guys. And so again, like you most of the time I'm taking a wide receiver over Clyde. Like you can get Mccaffrey, Justin Jefferson, or maybe even Ridley sometimes there. And so I prefer all 3 of the other guys in this tier. That's Mixon, Najee Harris, and Austin Eckler over Clyde. But in drafts, I'm fine with Clyde because you can just get him half a round later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Joe Mixon. This is a player that you've been vocally opposed to. Do you want to give the people a quick summation if they haven't heard your take?
Yeah, I mean, if people are listening, if they've been listeners of the podcast, they would know that I'm just never drafting Joe Mixon. I mean, I drafted him last year for like the first time ever, just burned me completely. Good thing I traded him before he ended up not playing another game for the entire season. And it feels like we've just been waiting for a Joe Mixon breakout forever now. And is this going to be the year? Maybe. The opportunity is there. I do agree with that. Like Jack mentioned, Geo Bernard left and his backup is Samaje Perine. So the opportunity should be there. The offensive environment is great. A lot of talent on the offensive side of the ball. Offensive line is a concern. But I don't know. It's just so hard for me to draft and trust Joe Mixon again. I just stay away. Like, it's just a personal bias, maybe kind of hatred towards Joe Mixon. I just can't do it. I can't. I'm sorry. I just can't.
Gotta let that hate go. Let it go from your heart and embrace the Joe Mixon train. It's going to be a money-making train.
For me, this is the first year I've ever been in on Joe Mixon. And I know a lot of people feel like you, Joey, where they have just drafted Mixon for years on end, waiting for him to actually do something, and he never had. Or I mean, he's done well. He just kind of has never lived up to the expectations people had for him. But I think it could be different this year because the offense is ascending with Burrow coming back, and then Geo is gone. Geo has never had fewer than 43 targets in a season. Samaje Perine has 40 targets in his career, so I really think that pass catching role is going to open up for Mixon to take over. And then the Bengals OC said pre-draft that they don't want to take him off the field. I know Zach Taylor said a few days ago that they don't want him on the field for 75 plays a game, but I think that piece of news was not really relevant because no running back is playing 75 plays a game. I think as long as he takes over that Geo Bernard pass catching role, I think Mixon could smash this year.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
But I might be wrong, and maybe this is my Joe Mixon experience.
I mean, the arguments are definitely in favor of Joe Mixon. Like, I acknowledge that. It's just, like I said, a personal thing. I've been burned by him. A lot of people have been burned by him, so I'm just completely off the train. I do think he's a fine draft pick at his ADP. He's going as the RB12, so back end RB1. Think it's fine just due to the opportunity, but I don't know. Maybe I just have to change my stance on him.
Maybe you do. Somebody that I've been really hesitant to change my stance on is the first player as we move into tier 4, and that's Antonio Gibson. This is a tier that I've labeled as confident running back twos, guys who have enough workload and enough upside to be in that top 24 range. It's just there's also question marks. Antonio Gibson, DeAndre Swift, Myles Gaskin, J.K. Dobbins, Miles Sanders, Travis Etienne, Chris Carson, Kareem Hunt, and Mike Davis. Am I on an island with this take of Antonio Gibson? Because if you look at ADP and you look at the way that people regard him, I think that the general consensus is that he should be in the tier above.
I think I'd put him in the tier above, near the back of the tier above. It's interesting because at this time last year, Gibson was a converted wide receiver Memphis and a very productive, very efficient college wide receiver Memphis. So we know he has the receiving skills, or at least his college profile would indicate that he does. And the question was, can he play running back? And then last year, it was the complete opposite of what we expected. He had 160 plus carries, and J.D. Mckissick was the pass catching guy. And so I think that he kind of silenced the doubts that we had about him, because the concerns were, can he run between the tackles? Last year, he showed he could do that. He showed he could get goal line carries. So he has the rushing workload. It's just a question of whether he eats into Mckissick's receiving role. And the Washington coaches have been saying all the right things about how they're going to try to involve him more in the passing game this year. Plus, we think he has the talent given what he showed in college. So I would put Gibson at the back end of the second tier, but I get how maybe it requires more projection than you're comfortable with for a second tier running back or a third tier running back.
It does. It just, to me, feels like there's a lot of wish casting going on. Like you said, they silenced the criticisms about, can he run the ball well, but I think it's just shifted the criticisms to, will he get the opportunity to catch the pass more, to catch more passes, because Mckissick, was averaging more than double the targets per game, 6.6 to Antonio Gibson's 3.07. And they still have the same coaching staff, same OC and Scott Turner. And Mckissick, his usage catching passes out of the backfield was significantly a concerted effort from the team. He had 80 receptions on 111 targets, second most targets per game in the league, second most receptions in the league at the running back position. And I just don't know if that's going to change beyond any reason of people just simply wanting it to change.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think Mckissick will have a role. Antonio Gibson had 44 targets last year. I do expect that to increase, and he still finished as the RB13 in full PPR last season. I think the rushing workload is there for him, like Jack mentioned, and I do believe that he will see more targets, but McKissick will be there. And McKissick is also a wide receiver. He was a wide receiver in college, and he converted to a running back, so he has wide receiver experience as well. They have two great pass catchers at the running back position, and I think they're going to use both of them.
Jack, how are you handling this group in drafts, maybe outside of just the running back aspect of it? Because a lot of the times we know that it's more optimal to pick wide receivers in this range in rounds 3 through 5, especially in terms of win rates. That's been a more successful strategy over the past few years. So in general, are these guys that you're targeting, or are you almost always going to be going with the wide receivers in these spots?
Right. For the most part, I'm going wide receiver in the spots just because the win rates are pretty clear. There's been, for 6 consecutive years, running backs with an ADP in rounds 3 through 6 have had a below average win rate, and wide receivers have had an above average win rate. So in my opinion, it doesn't get a whole lot easier than that, and I tend to lean toward wide receiver in this position. I think Swift might get interesting if his ADP continues to drop, because he also profiles as someone who should catch a lot of passes. He did well as a receiver last year, and then the Lions have no wide receivers, so it's going to be Hawkinson and Swift for the most part catching passes. So Swift could get triple-digit targets this year. The Lions are going to be in negative game script a lot, and his ADP is falling now because of what Anthony Lynn has said about Jamal Williams. So I think if Swift dips into round 4 or so, that's where he might start to get interesting for me. But even then, the wide receivers are so good in this range that I might just hammer wide receivers.
Mm-hmm. Are you in on the J.K. Dobbins hype? Because we've talked about it recently. He's one of our top 5 fades at ADP.
Clear cut.
Just can't get on board with J.K. Dobbins. He's going to be losing work to Lamar Jackson. He's going to be losing work to Gus Edwards, and he was frequently not used in scoring position last year over Gus Edwards. It seems like a clear cut fluke that he finished with more rushing touchdowns than Edwards did, and his current ADP, he's just untouchable in my opinion.
Definitely with you there. I think Mark Ingram was inactive for the first time last year in week 8, and then in weeks 9 through 17, Dobbins averaged 12.1 carries per game. Edwards was at 9.8, I want to say, and then Lamar was also at 12.1. So it's going to be a 3-way split, and then Ravens RBs during that same period averaged 2.2 total targets per game. So it's just tough to profile to project him for too much of the rushing market share, and he's probably not going to catch that many passes. So tough for me to draft him there.
Yeah, I mean, there's been the reports that the Ravens want to involve their running backs in the passing game, but we kind of talked about it on our last official podcast where it's a statistical trend with Greg Roman offenses that the running backs are not going to get targets. I don't see that changing. So J.K. Dobbins is a clear-cut fade. And I'll say, for me personally, most of these guys in this tier I haven't been drafting much of. I don't have many shares of Gibson or Swift. Got a couple Myles Gaskin shares, but that's when he was going in the 7th, 8th round when he was just a clear-cut value. Other than that, I'm not really interested in many of these guys. I mean, Chris Carson is interesting. Rashad Penny apparently underwent surgery to clean up his knee, so I think his workload is solid in Seattle. We know they want to use him. He has touchdown upside, I think, as well as the only running back there. Other than that, I think I'm just kind of staying away from these guys, to be honest. Like Jack mentioned, the wide receivers are just so much better in these rounds. I think their ceilings are just way higher than these running backs, and I'd much rather go there than these running backs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. If we move on to tier 5, these are guys that I think, they have at least the projection of solid workloads, but they're guaranteed to split significant snaps on a weekly basis. And again, it just comes down to what Jack mentioned earlier. The wide receivers in this range are just too good to pass up compared to these massive question marks. I'll be honest, tier 5 only consists of a couple guys: David Montgomery, Josh Jacobs, James Robinson, and Chase Edmonds. And I'm flat out just out on these guys. Jack, how do you feel about this tier?
I'm the same way. I'm taking wide receivers over these guys pretty much every time.
Yep. I'm right there with both of you. I mean, David Montgomery is also one of our top 5 fades. I mean, I think clear cut David Montgomery is going to bust in 2021. Not taking much Josh Jacobs, James Robinson. We were drafting him a lot pre-draft. That kind of burned us. I'm high on Chase Edmonds, and that's been kind of like a point on this podcast between Ben and I, is whether or not Chase Edmonds is a good pick. And I will say his ADP has rose significantly over the last month or two, and his price is kind of high. He's going in the 6th round on Underdog, 5th, 6th round, and I will say that is kind of high. I still like Chase Edmonds as a player. I think he has the receiving role that we want in our running backs, but I know that Ben is not as high on Chase Edmonds as I am. So
yeah, I just, whenever you have the chance to draft a running back who's going to finish 3rd in red zone attempts on his own team, got to take it in the 6th round. Lock it up.
It is kind of high.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, tier 6, Jack. Is this the tier that you would consider sort of the running back dead zone? This is a narrative I've seen you speak about on Twitter, and these are guys that, they have potential to really break into being, dominant players on their own team. Devante Williams could be the lead, Trey Sermon, Damian Harris, James Conner, Zach Moss, Tony Pollard, maybe not so much the chance to be the RB1, maybe an outside chance, but, Fournette, Drake, Melvin Gordon. These are guys that, they're sort of all over the place in ADP, but they're players that I think have significant upside, especially in formats like Underdog and DraftKings, where, all you really need is for them to catch fire in the right weeks 15 through 17.
Yeah, so I'd consider actually the previous couple of tiers the RB dead zone, because usually that's rounds 3 through 6. And then so this tier would be where you're kind of breaking out of the RB dead zone. And these guys, for me at least, would be some guys that I'm looking to target, because if you're loading up on wide receivers in rounds 3 through 6, you probably are playing catch up at running back. And so a lot of these guys I think are interesting. I think Sermon has a lot of upside this year. Connor too, like you mentioned. Kenyon Drake out-touched Chase Edmonds within the 5-yard line 22-1 last year. So Edmonds had 1 goal line carry the entire season. I think Connor might be the guy who's taking over that Drake role this year, and so he is one of my favorite targets right now. Kenyon Drake too. The Raiders signed him to a 2-year, $14.5 million contract. I know it's the Raiders and they kind of just do whatever they want, but I mean, for that kind of money, you got to think they're going to use him. And Jacobs has never been much of a pass catcher. Early reports from Raiders beat writers indicate that Drake is going to be that guy that uses a pass catcher. And then so he'll start the year with a receiving role, and then if something happens to Jacobs, he could just absolutely smash. So a lot of these guys are targets for me.
How do you feel about the two Broncos running backs? They seem to be going higher than maybe they should in terms of how we regard this team and the scoring opportunity that they're going to have with the Drew Lock / Teddy Bridgewater led offense. But, theoretically, Melvin Gordon is potentially a cut candidate. Devante Williams could really dominate if he finds himself, in the right situation if things break right.
Right. The recent Devante Williams hypes has me thinking I might not have enough, because I know a lot of smart people that really like him. And then there is smoke about Melvin being a cut candidate, but Devante does it like the 5-6 turn. And at that point, I'm taking wide receivers more often than not. But Devante Williams, I think, is a pretty interesting pick, especially if we start to hear more about Melvin Gordon being on the roster bubble.
So with me in this tier, I've got Tony Pollard all the way up at 28. He's sort of at the top of this tier for me, and his ADP is far below these guys. He's really going in the 10th round, 11th if you're lucky, maybe back end of the 9th. But, he's a guy that I think has really untapped upside. He's kind of like some of the guys we'll get to in a while in terms of being an injury away from being a league winner. But I also think that he has potential to see, 25 to 35% of snaps in one of the best offenses in the league. And we know the talent's there. We saw it when he had the opportunity last year, and, everyone's all on board with the Zeke rebound, but I think it's possible that Tony Pollard could really shine this year if given the opportunity.
I think Pollard's an interesting case because he's going around guys like Connor and Drake who should have much more of a role early on. But then the upside for Pollard is like RB1 overall if something happens to Zeke. So in that regard, I understand why a lot of people love Tony Pollard, and I'm going to be overweight on Tony Pollard. But I just worry that maybe we're overestimating how much he'll actually be involved if Zeke is healthy, especially compared to guys like Drake and Connor, who are locked in their respective roles as either pass catcher, between the tackles, 2 down back. So that's where I'm at with Pollard, but I will be overexposed to Tony Pollard. So, yeah.
Joey, Damian Harris, you're New England Patriots. I see that little helmet in the background. What do you think about Harris? Reports recently are that he's the clear-cut running back 1 in Patriots minicamp.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, he was the clear-cut best Patriots running back last year, and I do think he is the starter this season. For fantasy, he's more of a floor guy, just because he's not going to be catching passes. And then if Cam Newton starts all 17 games, you have a quarterback that will 100% vulture rushing touchdowns in the red zone at the goal line. So I don't really have much shares this year. I was high on him last year, kind of didn't really work out, but I don't know. I mean, I don't think he should be in this tier personally.
Tier lower?
Probably. Well, your tier lower is an injury away. I don't think he's an injury away because he's a starter. I don't know. It's hard to put him in a tier because, like I said, he's just kind of like a floor guy that I'm staying away from. I don't think he has league winning upside, to be honest.
Got you. Well, let's get into that tier, and we can sort of talk about tier 7 and 8 in conjunction, especially with Jack here, because, your recent article on ETR reflecting on the archetype of running backs and the guys that we want to target, the guys that, give you superior win rates, almost has me considering just completely switching these tiers. Because from the information that you had in that article, it seems like guys in my 8th tier, guys like Tariq Cohen, Naheem Hines, JD McKissick, these pass catching running backs are actually safer, higher win rate picks compared to the guys that are really, an injury away, like Alexander Madison, Darrell Henderson, Latavius Murray, Rashad Penny, etc.
Yeah, so the one thing with that article is it was for full PPR, and then underdogs obviously half PPR. So there's a bit of a difference there in terms of how pass catchers are valued. But at the same time, Hines and Cohen and McKissick are going higher on full PPR. So maybe it balances itself out in that way. But I think the main thing for me is I did this other article for ETR about how we define upside and what it means and if we quantify it right. And it basically found that we want to look for guys that actually have a role. And so Edwards is in this tier, Hines, Cohen, McKissick. All of those guys will have a role from week 1. And then in tier 7, some of these guys like A.J. Dillon, Latavius Murray, probably Henderson too, they are an injury away from being a league winner, but they also have a week 1 role. And those are the types of guys, in my opinion, that are super interesting where, Latavius Murray and A.J. Dillon might score a touchdown every few weeks. And then in those weeks, they will be starters. And so they're contributing to your team, even if they don't hit their 90th percentile outcome. But if an injury happens, then they absolutely crush and they're winning you leagues. So I think the guys like from these 2 tiers, that would be Henderson, Murray, Dillon, Edwards, as guys who have a role and then could smash if there's an injury. I think those guys are my preferred running backs from these 2 tiers, and then Hines, Cohen, and McKissick, since they'll have a role week 1, even if they lack that RB, top 5, top 10 ceiling in the event of an injury, just because they'll have a week 1 role as the pass catcher and they should maintain that role the entire season. That would be how I'd separate it, kind of.
Right. Well, I mean, some of these guys, if you were for example, drafting off of these tiers, you would be landing Cohen all the time because he's going, 40 picks later than some of these guys. So, you don't have to draft him off of these tiers. It's just that I think that those roles are very valuable, especially considered to some of the players that we'll get to momentarily that are going ahead of him that just wildly overdrafted, in my opinion. But, Jack, does it come down to roster construction for you? Because when I'm drafting these teams, I feel like I'm a lot less likely to go after these quote unquote floor players like McKissick or Cohen, opposed to Alexander Mattison, if say they're my running back 5, if I go robust running back earlier, it's like, how often are these guys really going to outproduce a strong running back team? Whereas if I'm hammering wide receivers in those mid rounds, then I'm probably going to come here because I need that safety at running back on a week to week basis.
Definitely. I think that's definitely a good way of thinking about it. And I tend to go maybe lighter on running backs than most people. And so I do end up with those pass catchers a lot because I need the production, but I think that's definitely something you have to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Joey, any thoughts on these 2 tiers and how you would value them in comparison to one another?
Yeah, I just personally value tier 8 more than tier 7. Is just kind of like how I go about drafting best ball teams. And I know Ben and myself, we draft a lot on Drafters, which is a full PPR best ball site. So that's kind of why I gear more towards, the Gus Edwards, or not Gus Edwards. That's why I gear more towards like drafting Hines, drafting Tariq Cohen, and even Kenyon Drake in the previous tiers, because I know that they're going to have the roles on their teams as the pass catchers. Even if they're not going to have, 70% of the touches, the roles are still valuable on full PPR sites. And I will say Tariq Cohen is my most owned player across every best ball site because I was drafting him in the 18th round every single time. And my most owned player by far.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's solid. People are forgetting he's a couple seasons removed from just being a dominant pass catcher, and that's not going to be David Montgomery again.
A couple seasons removed from being an RB1 in fantasy.
And the last note that I would personally have on this tier is that, especially in tier 7, when you're looking at guys like Madison, Henderson, Murray, Penny, etc., I'm very consciously trying to spread my exposure to these guys out evenly because, if you're going too hard on one, you're essentially kind of trying to project an injury or predict an injury of one player over the other. And I think that that's definitely a losing strategy. But I think the value is, in getting a decent amount of exposure to each of these guys so that if that injury occurs, we know injuries are very likely at the running back position, you're at least set up to benefit from that in some way.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, moving on to tier 9. And, these are guys that if you're looking at my ranks versus ADP, I'm well below market on these players. And I just don't see the appeal. I really don't see the appeal to almost any of these guys. Michael Carter, Raheem Mostert, Ronald Jones, David Johnson, Jamal Williams, Devin Singletary. If they were going, a couple rounds later, I could see it, but it just seems like you're paying way too much in opportunity cost over a lot of the wide receivers, the tight ends, the quarterbacks that you're going to be looking at in these, rounds, say 8 through 11, when you have to take these guys.
Yeah. So I think we've mostly agreed so far, but I disagree on a few of these.
Let me know.
I'll start with the first guy on the list. I think Michael Carter are you just not on him because is it the Jets or is it draft capital?
I mean, it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column
Yeah.
B, and it's just I don't see necessarily that he's just going to step in and be this dominant, workload guy. I think they'll give Coleman some touches. I think they'll give Ty Johnson some touches, and there's obviously a lot of mouths to feed in terms of targets. I just don't know what his realistic upside is in terms of somebody that we have to take in the 8th round.
Right. So he, to me, should start. The early reports are that he's going to start as a pass catching back, and that kind of fits with his size. He's a smaller back, and then it fits with what he did in college in conjunction with Devante Williams. And it's very positive to me that as a 4th round pick, he's already getting reps with the starters. So I think even though he's, a day 3 pick, and for me, that's the main argument against him is day 3 backs rarely turn out. But since he's already getting reps with the ones in mid-June, I think that projects nicely for him to open the season with a pass catching role, and then for that to potentially grow throughout the season, because it's kind of like Drake in the sense that he should start the year as a pass catcher and then could potentially ascend, but Drake needs an injury, whereas Carter might just be able to become the RB1 by being better than Tevin Coleman and Ty Johnson, because the Jets depth chart at running back is really thin, so Carter might just take over that role. And then Raheem Mostert is the next guy. I think he's interesting too because the 49ers rushing efficiency could rival the Ravens. And Mike Leone, who's over at ETR, I think made a really good point to me yesterday. He said, for the Ravens, we've got Dobbins going in the 3rd round, Edwards going in the 9th round. And the 49ers could have similar efficiency, and yet Sermon and Mostert are both going in the 7th round. So it's kind of an arbitrage situation there, because it's almost the opposite of what I just said for Carter, because if we expect Sermon to take over more of the rushing pie throughout the season, Mostert would be the guy who opens the year as the starter and then maybe cede some of the work to Sermon throughout the season. And so in tournaments, that's something to think about, because maybe over the second half of the season, it's more Sermon and less Mostert. And for those all-important weeks, 15 through 17, you might not be getting as much production. But for normal leagues, I think especially Mostert intrigues me, because the only reason Sermon is getting starting reps right now at 49ers minicamp and OTAs is that Mostert's out. I think he should be the clear 1A for week 1. And then beyond that, I think Jamal Williams also kind of just the same thing. He should have a role week 1, and then if something happens to Swift, he'll do more. And Singletary, I'm not really sure why Singletary is going 4 rounds behind Zach Moss. I get that the Bills' backfield isn't especially lucrative because they don't use their running backs that much, but I kind of feel like those guys should be going a lot closer. And so it's not that I'm like a Singletary guy or anything. It's just kind of I don't know. If Moss is going at the 8-9 turn, Singletary 4 rounds later seems pretty good.
Yeah, I agree with that take to an extent, but to me, it's just like you said. I mean, if we're valuing the later weeks more, I'm going to be targeting guys like Sermon, Jamal Williams. I don't know. What is his realistic upside? It's these, like, I see your points, and like these are guys that I have interest in. Singletary outside of this in this tier is the guy that I have the most of because he's going so much later than the rest of them. But it really just comes down to the way that I'm usually constructing rosters. I don't want to take David Johnson or Ronald Jones in the 8th or 9th round. Give me the quarterbacks, give me some upside quarterbacks, give me some tight ends to solidify the build. It really comes down to roster construction and the ADPs more so than the players themselves. But the Michael Carter point is definitely one to consider. Maybe he needs to be moved up a couple of tiers. Joey, thoughts on Carter or any of these other guys you disagree with?
Yeah, I agree with Jack about Michael Carter, and then Ronald Jones. I think having him in tier 9 is pretty disrespectful. I would put him in tier 6. Like, if you're going to put Leonard Fournette in tier 6, I think you have to have Ronald Jones in tier 6. Maybe I could see why you have him above Ronald Jones just due to his pass game role with the Bucs. But I think Ronald Jones is the starter in 2021 day 1, and we saw last year, he does have upside. He does have spike weeks in his range of outcomes. He finished as the RB20 in full PPR. So I just don't understand the Ronald Jones tier 9, potential contributors. As long as he's healthy, he's going to be a factor in that Bucs backfield.
Jack, are you a Rojo guy?
I'm not a Rojo guy, but I do think this is probably too low for him.
Yeah. All right. If enough smart people have the same opinion, I could be completely wrong about that. So I'll definitely take that into consideration, guys. Moving on to tier 10, we got 2 more tiers to close this thing out. And this to me is sort of the group of guys that I think is the last really viable tier of players that you want to be drafting, especially on a site like Underdog where there's only 18th rounds. Maybe this list expands a bit on DraftKings or Drafters where we're talking 20 rounds or FFPC, et cetera, whatever you're talking about. But these are guys that strictly to me are RB5s. They're very speculative, very low floors, but if things break right, you could get a couple of spike weeks out of them. Darrington Evans, Philip Lindsey, Marlon Mack, the forgotten man, got, Salvin Ahmed, Javian Hawkins, Wayne Gallman, Mike Boone, and then a couple of Patriots running backs as well, and Ramondre Stevenson and James White. What are your guys' thoughts on this tier, sort of strictly RB5 types?
I like James White a lot. I think it kind of comes down to Mac Jones, like Joey was talking about with Damien Harris. Mac Jones is kind of the key to the key to success for Patriots weapons, because if Cam hurts the running backs because he's going to take a lot of the rushing workload, and then they're not going to throw that much. So if Mac Jones starts, though, James White had the 3rd highest target share among running backs last year. I think it was around 15%. He's just a couple years removed from a pair of top 24 finishes in full PPR in running backs. So if Mac Jones is the starter early in the season, or if he gets any significant playing time, I think White is a nice option, kind of what we talked about earlier with that pass catching role being undervalued generally. I think White is kind of one of the cheaper guys you can get in that archetype. Philip Lindsey too. It's kind of gross to take a Texans running back, but if you don't like David Johnson and you think he's dust, which he easily could be, then Philip Lindsey makes sense, even if the Texans offense is going to be just terrible. Beyond that, Evans, if Henry gets hurt, he could do some real nice things, but they brought in Brian Hill, and we're not really that good at predicting in preseason who's going to be the beneficiary of an injury. I did some work for NBC about that, and how Evans could easily break out. He was a 3rd-round pick last year, but maybe we're wrong and we're just overconfident in Evans actually being the RB2. So beyond White and maybe Lindsey, I don't even want to take like a bullish stance on Lindsey just because it's so gross with the Texans offense. But I like James White a lot. Beyond that, a lot of these guys I think aren't as interesting to me personally.
Let me just quickly make the case for Marlon Mack. This is a man who's only 1 year removed from being the RB23 in fantasy points per game, 2 years from removed from being RB14. Obviously, there's the Jonathan Taylor edition, which really throws a wrench in that. But I think that he has sort of that high-end running back to appeal if, JT was ever to go down. It's not going to be Hines in there getting the bulk of those touches. And, he's essentially a guy who you could throw in the injury away tier, except he's going 6 rounds later than Madison, Henderson, et cetera. I mean, sometimes he's not even drafted. So I think there's a lot of appeal there as a 19th, 20th round pick. Good defense, amazing O-line, could be positive game scripts, and he's done it before. So to me, Marlon Mack just completely forgotten. I know everyone loves JT. I mean, we love JT, but I don't know. Marlon Mack, I think, is just completely under the radar right now.
I was a Marlon Mack fan, but Jonathan Taylor there, I think he takes a step into being the workhorse running back. And like you mentioned, he's probably an injury away, Marlon Mack, that is, from actually having fantasy relevance. And that's pretty much all of these guys. They're not going to be relevant at all in fantasy football for 2021, I think. And, if I'm drafting in the 18th, 19th, 20th round, I'm taking shots on wide receivers over running backs, just higher ceilings, higher boom week potential than these guys. But James White, just talking about him, I do think he needs Mac Jones to play, and we talked about this on the last episode for quarterbacks. I personally believe Cam Newton is the guy for 2021. Barring him just being completely trash, and he might be, but he did show that he was kind of capable, especially early in the season. Then he got COVID, he got hurt too. So hopefully Cam Newton can stay healthy, and if he does, I do think he will be the starter for the entire season. Just that bridge quarterback for the Patriots.
No concerns about reports that Ramondre Stevenson is a better pass catcher than expected, potentially taking some of that work away from James White this year?
I would not worry about that too much. White has been the guy there forever. I think he has that kind of locked up.
James White has that role locked up. It's just how much are they going to use that role? They brought in 4 pass catchers, Hunter Henry, Jonnu, and the 2 wide receivers, so that it's more people to feed in the passing game. And will they pass a lot? Probably, maybe. I don't know. They'll probably still be bottom 8 in terms of pass attempts per game in 2021. I'm a Patriots fan, so I want them to pass more. It's better, but I don't think it'll happen.
Yep, that's a fair point. We can wrap things up here with tier 11. I'm not even going to read the names. We can put them on the screen if people want to see them. Most of these guys are just straight up irrelevant in terms, really only, players that I would consider draftable in 20 plus rounds. But is there anybody in this tier of, complete dart throws, Jack, that you have any interest in, or potentially somebody who's just straight up missing from the list, a deep sleeper?
Yeah, so I have some interest in Tevin, like we talked about. I like Michael Carter, but Tevin should start the year as a role. McKinnon maybe catches some passes. Malcolm Brown, I think, is the favorite for goal line work in Miami. So those 3 of the ones listed. And then someone that's not listed is Geo Bernard. And I think he's going to be the main pass catching back in Tampa for Tom Brady. His ADP on Underdog has risen around over the last week or two. So people are definitely reacting to the Geo Bernard smoke, but I don't even think I'd have him in this tier. I think I'd have him a few tiers up, but I like Geo Bernard a lot this year.
Obviously, I'm just too bullish on Fournette and what he's going to do as a pass catcher. Big Fournette guy.
So that would leave Fournette and Rojo splitting, the first and second down work if Geo Bernard is that third down pass catching back. So that would probably make me target Geo, in the later rounds, 15, 16. I don't even know where he's going, honestly. But then that would kind of make Rojo and Fournette fades for me if the smoke is actually true.
2 guys that weren't on the original draft of this list that I've recently been coming around to as 19th, 20th round picks are the 2 Chargers backs. I think Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelly both have some appeal. They are in a loaded offense, and one of them should have a role in addition to Austin Eckler. I don't know which one it is necessarily, but I think that it's worth splitting exposure, taking them with a 20th round pick, 19th round pick, and just, hoping, because they also have appeal if Eckler ever goes down. And, one of them could theoretically be the Chargers goal line back.
I think that's a good shout because Eckler didn't get too much goal line work last year. And especially Justin Jackson, especially if Eckler goes down, has shown he can handle the load. So,
And they invested, what was it, a third round pick in Joshua Kelly too?
Third or fourth.
Yeah, it was a third or fourth round pick. So I think those 2 guys will have a role in the Chargers offense besides Eckler. Obviously, it's not going to be a very valuable role, but if Eckler does go down, we saw it last year, he missed significant time. They'll definitely be fantasy relevant. But for best ball right now, I'm probably not drafting much of them. Those guys are just more of the DFS guys, 4K, plug them in week 12 if Eckler's out, pick them up on the waiver wire in your redraft leagues.
Hey, now that the GOAT Kalen Ballage is gone, somebody's got to step up.
Exactly.
I guess the last question I have with this tier is, do you guys have a strong read on who the Chiefs back that we should be targeting outside of Clyde Edwards-Helaire is? Obviously, there's a bunch of guys there. Darwin Thompson, people have been waiting to happen. Darrell Williams, the actual guy who was semi-productive last year, and then they added Jerick McKinnon. I was just stunned to even find out he was still in the league. But, theoretically, these guys also have some upside as well, being in the Chiefs offense, and all of them are essentially free in drafts right now.
I think that's a kind of an important question to ask because that role as Kansas City's running back definitely has some potential, especially if something happens to Clyde, but even maybe in tandem with Clyde. And I think Darwin Thompson is kind of out of the picture almost. I think Darrell Williams had an actual role last year, and then they brought in McKinnon this year. So those are the two guys who I think it's between. McKinnon goes higher right now, but I don't have too strong of a take either way on who it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Joey, any final notes here?
If I had to pick one, it would probably be Darrell Williams. They showed an inclination to use him, as that third down back because he's good in pass protection and he can catch passes. And he was pretty solid last year. He did pretty well. I think he scored a touchdown late in the season or in one of the playoff games where he was like 4K on DraftKings, and I played him at like 2%. So I like Darrell Williams. I think he's the RB2 in Kansas City.
Yep, and if that's true, then he is a value, I would say. Jack, any final words about the running back position as a whole as it relates to 2021 best ball tournaments? Any gems you can drop for the people here?
I guess all I would say is just from a kind of top-down view, the running back dead zone is something I kind of want to leave the listeners with, because rounds 3 through 6 have historically been a really rough spot for running backs. So I would avoid guys in those range. Either get your running backs early with those first 2 or 3 tiers we talked about, or wait until you're in the Trey Sermon, Devante range to start picking the position.
Well, thank you so much for coming by. This is going to be it for episode 146 of the DFS Dose podcast. If you're not already, make sure you're following us on Twitter at the DFS Dose. I'm at Ben Hauver. Joey's at Joey Carrion. And of course, you can find Jack at Jack Miller02 on Twitter. Jack, tell the people where they can find your content if they don't already know.
Yeah, you can find me on Establish the Run and NBC Sports Edge. Thank you guys for having me. This was fun.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming by. Next up, we have Matthew Betts for the FF Ballers joining us to talk wide receiver. Should be an absolutely loaded episode. Keep an eye out for that. As always, if you're listening out there, just know we appreciate you. We value you. Until next time, let's stay accountable and keep it authentic. Vibes.